Let me introduce you to a job that can be considered a true one-man army on the battlefield, capable of smiting foes and shielding allies. The Vanguard. The Vanguard is a powerful physical tank, excelling in pumping out high physical damage numbers while being able to then immediately take incoming physical attacks without breaking a sweat. Because of this, the Vanguard often wants to equip both a weapon and a shield, since maxing out this job's damage potential doesn't require much effort, so dual-wielding swords or axes isn't even necessary. Besides, the Vanguard doesn't do as well when confronting magic damage, so that extra defense from the shield can really do wonders. Now, onto the Vanguard specialties. First, we have Shield Bearer. When equipping shields on the Vanguard, any speed, aim, or evasion penalties will be nullified, practically removing any real downside from using shields that would hinder the Vanguard from being able to contribute often in combat. Aim is already an underwhelming stat for this job, so this is a net gain for the job in all areas. And their other specialty is Attention Seeker, which will raise the Vanguard's physical attack power and critical hit rate based on their chance of being targeted. This is the means by which the Vanguard's attack power skyrockets past any other attacker in the game, as by equipping weapons and armor that provide a lot of aggro, your damage and critical hit rate are boosted as well. Even with weapon types that the Vanguard doesn't often use, like daggers or staves, can push this job's physical attack potential to its maximum without much issue. This is another reason to pair this job with one weapon and a shield, since getting as much as you can out of this specialty is extremely important for utilizing the Vanguard to its fullest extent. Next, the Vanguard's special move is Fault Line. The Vanguard picks an enemy and deals a powerful, earth-based physical attack on them. The bonus effect of Fault Line is a 30% physical defense boost for the entire party. Obviously, this move will hit extremely hard thanks to it being physical damage and can be easily spammed since you only need to use 13 heroic actions to activate it. The only major thing to keep in mind when using this specialty is that pesky little earth element tied to it, as there are quite a few enemies and bosses who resist, nullify, or straight up absorb that element, so pick your targets wisely. Now let's move on to the Vanguard's combat abilities, starting with Crosscut and Neo Cross Slash, attained at job level 1 and 12. Crosscut is a low-cost move that attacks an enemy twice with a slightly higher damage multiplier being applied to the second hit. This is a very good early to mid-game attack that lets the Vanguard melt enemies and bosses alike. Taking advantage of weapon weaknesses will help go a long way in making Crosscut an attack to fear until you get access to Neo Cross Slash. This attack is basically a straight upgrade to Crosscut, dealing 2 powerful physical attacks up to an opponent, with the second hit being slightly stronger than the first. Both of these moves benefit from the Vanguard's physical damage boost and high critical chance thanks to Attention Seeker, since each hit can crit separate from each other. Though the biggest downside to keep in mind when using these abilities is your MP bar on Vanguard. Don't go too crazy and waste turns on attacks you can't use. Second up is Shield Bash and Shield Stun, unlocked at job level 2 and 8. These abilities use up a chunk of the Vanguard's health to deal damage to an opponent with their shield and delay the enemy's next turn, though there are some slight differences between the two. Shield Bash is an earth-based physical attack that only slightly delays the target's next action, while Shield Stun is a regular physical attack that significantly delays the target's action, but also at the cost of a lot more HP. Use these if you know an opponent you don't want acting is about to move, but keep in mind that these stuns aren't always guaranteed to delay an enemy's action for too terribly long. Next is Defang and Skull Bash, obtained at job level 3 and 4. Both of these actions are debuffs that the Vanguard can use to lower an enemy's attack power, with Defang lowering physical damage and Skull Bash lowering magical damage. The effects of these attacks can be stacked with each other for a large damage debuff, so when faced with an enemy or boss that dishes out an insane amount of damage, have the Vanguard play support and cut their opponent's damage output incredibly. Now onto a trio of abilities, Aggravate, Enrage, and Infuriate, unlocked at job level 6, 10, and 13 respectively. Let's go ahead and talk about Aggravate and Infuriate first. These two abilities raise the user's chance of being targeted by a specified percentage, 25% with Aggravate and 50% with Infuriate. This increases the chance of the Vanguard being targeted by enemies in combat, letting them take hits for their more fragile teammates. However, it isn't always the most reliable. Although, hope is not lost for these abilities, as they do in fact synergize with the Vanguard's Attention Seeker specialty, meaning that having either of these buffs applied will boost the Vanguard's physical attack power and critical chance significantly. Because of this, I personally tend to see Aggravate and Infuriate as more personal damage buffs rather than aggro management tools. That honor goes to Enrage, which guarantees that an enemy's next 2 single target actions will be directed at the user. This is the Vanguard's means of keeping the heat off their team, letting them play as the party's tank in situations where every hit from the enemy could be deadly. Enrage's effects can be spread to an entire group of enemies with the across-the-board passive. Next up is yet another batch of abilities, Sword of Stone and Quake Blade, obtained at level 7 and 14. Both of these actions are earth-based physical attacks focused on a single target, with Sword of Stone being a weaker, less costly version of Quake Blade. Utilizing these attacks is pretty simple. If there's an enemy weak to the Earth element, have the Vanguard pull out these attacks and hit that weakness while still getting that huge physical damage buff from Attention Seeker. Having an Oracle use Elemental Impairment to apply Earth weaknesses onto enemies is also a great way to get mileage out of these attacks. Next is the Gift of Courage, unlocked at job level 11. This allows the user to donate one of their BP to another ally with no extra cost. Use this if the Vanguard doesn't immediately need to use their BP, and those extra actions can be better used on someone else for the time being. Do note that you cannot spread this donation to the entire party with the across-the-board passive. It will only ever be for one single target. And lastly, for combat abilities is Ultimatum, obtained at level 15. This is an incredibly powerful physical attack that hits all enemies on the field that will then lower the user's chance of being targeted until their next turn. This is basically the Vanguard's nuke ability, focused on clearing out groups of enemies and closing out battles very quickly. Also, as long as Ultimatum is used last in your lineup of actions for that turn, the lowered chance of being targeted won't affect your other attacks that benefit from Attention Seeker. Now we can finally move on to the Vanguard's passive abilities, starting with Pain into Gain, obtained at job level 5. The user of this passive has roughly a 30% chance of gaining a stacking damage buff when taking any form of damage when not defaulting. This stacking buff will increase the user's physical damage output by 1 to 3% each time Pain into Gain activates. This buff cannot be removed by any means until combat ends. Even buff removal abilities and death will not take away this damage increase. It is permanent. Simply put, this passive works wonders in long encounters where you're going to get hit frequently. Otherwise, it is pretty underwhelming. Do note that the chance of Pain into Gain activating can be increased with various luck-raising passives and abilities. And second up is Defensive Offense, obtained at job level 9. When the user attacks with any weapon equipped, all incoming damage aimed at the user will be reduced by 70% until their next turn. This defense buff will also be multiplied with other defense increasing modifiers like Salvemaker's Thrust and Parry passive or a Bard's Singing. Defensive Offense promotes the Vanguard to always stay aggressive when in combat, since they will be rewarded with a strong damage negation passive if they can land a single hit. Pairing this with Enrage and the already high damage output from Attention Seeker, the Vanguard can become a very effective tank that can also tear enemies asunder with their incredibly high physical damage and defenses. The Vanguard's game plan doesn't change very much as you progress through the game, as it more or less just gets more options that either upgrade off of older ones or open new avenues for how to approach fighting enemies. If the Vanguard's high damage output is needed or would be harmful to the team, they can provide debuffs or even be the party's BP battery while still taking damage thanks to Enrage. The Vanguard is actively encouraged to attack the enemy, since their aggro and greasing tools boost their physical attack, and Defensive Offense requires the Vanguard to attack their opponents. Not to mention that if the Vanguard is hit by attacks, they can have passives like Pain into Gain activate that will boost their attack power even further. Now, when looking at all of this, it becomes more about adding onto the Vanguard's kit rather than shifting the job into another playstyle when looking at sub-jobs. Probably the safest option for a sub-job would be the Freelancer, as it provides luck-increasing abilities to help Pain into Gain, a decent self-sustain action that helps to keep the Vanguard's HP and MP up, and, of course, there's Mimic, which allows for the Vanguard to spam their higher-cost moves even more frequently. Another decent choice for sub-job is Berserker, Not only do you get access to defense lowering debuffs to go along with the Fang and Skull Bash, but you also gain access to water-based physical attacks, easier access to AoE physical attacks, and strong single target moves. The Berserker moveset just allows for the Vanguard to cover even more bases on what they can do in combat, whether it's AoE damage, elemental coverage, or more debuffs. The Dragoon is in a similar boat, as it lets the Vanguard deal lightning-based physical damage and get access to a pretty strong self-sustain ability. This also opens up the Vanguard to lock certain enemies into a VP negative situation, letting the party open fire while the Vanguard holds them down. Then there's the Phantom, which gives the Vanguard easy access to a powerful damage-increasing and default-piercing buff, dark elemental coverage, and synergy with any jobs that can apply ailments, like the Black Mage or Salve Maker. The Vanguard is a monster of a job, as its whole kit works off of itself so well, letting everything this job do feel like it's controlling the fight. Attacking an enemy with what will be a very hard-hitting physical attack thanks to an Attention Seeker can provide various buffs. Then, when that enemy fights back, the Vanguard gains even more passive buffs that will then, in turn, make their next strikes hit even harder. All of this praise I've given this job throughout the video isn't to say that it is without flaws, however, as there are two major cracks in this job's armor. The Vanguard struggles to face magic damage head-on, with an E in magic defense, so it is incredibly important to make sure that the Vanguard has some sort of mitigation in place to deal with that, whether it is through elemental nullification or absorption, or just a crapload of buffs in combat. The other big weakness to make note is this job's terrible aim stat, which can lead to some critical misses that can really set this job's playstyle back quite a bit. Setting aside a few gear pieces or passives to deal with this issue is very important, as landing hits is something this job needs to do for all of their kit to work well with each other. Overall though, the Vanguard is an impressive force on the battlefield that is incredibly easy to use and build, that if used well, will carry your team to victory regardless of who your opponent is. Finally, we've come to the faction tier list. Let's start with Seth. Now, I'll be honest right out of the gate here. The Vanguard design is definitely not one of my favorites. While I think the job outfits in this game are overall very good and work well with the change in art direction with this new Bravely title, this is one of the cases where I feel like the clay style of the characters and the glossy armor of the Vanguard just don't mix very well. I also find these designs to be a little too busy for my taste, with the flowing straps on their backs and bright colors to be too distracting, even if that fits with the "look at me, not them" idea of the Vanguard. Seth sadly just doesn't look good in this outfit in my opinion. He looks like he's wearing one of those bulky muscle shirts that you get at Party City or something, and it just doesn't look right. This will be our first D tier placement of the series. Now, with Gloria, I at least like the addition of the armored headpiece and the more rustic look of her armor. It's still not anything to write home about, but I do find it more appealing than the red and silver armor look of Seth's outfit. Low C tier. Third up is Elvis, and he's in a similar position as Seth, where I just don't like the overall look of the character models in the armor itself. Though at least it doesn't look like Elvis is wearing a muscle shirt quite as much as Seth. Still a D tier placement, but at least higher than Seth. Now, Adele's design is definitely my favorite of the bunch here, as I think the colors of her outfit actually make the Vanguard armor look more natural and unique to her than anyone else's. I think a high C tier placement works for her for right now, though that might change in the future.